Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our conversation today. And our conversation today is with Kim Loliya. Hello, Kim. It's really lovely to spend some time with you today.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So, Kim, you're the director of Black Psychotherapy. You're also a therapist yourself and specialize in trauma. I just wondering if you'd like to say a little bit more about what you do and your organization, Black Psychotherapy in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. I initially trained as a integrative psychotherapist, and pretty much from the beginning, I worked a lot within racialized communities, supporting folks with trauma. So trauma played a big part of my practice, even from when I did my placement. And since then, I have specialized in trauma therapy with somatic body-based elements as well. And that includes racialized trauma, family, intergenerational trauma, workplace. It's really an umbrella term for so many different types of trauma and day-to-day experiences within our communities as well. And I was happily in private practice for some time. And then I wanted to be able to serve more of my community. And that's really how Black psychotherapy emerged as a service provision for racialized communities with decolonial, intersectional, and anti-oppressive counseling and psychotherapy.
Well, that's a huge undertaking, isn't it? When you develop out of your private practice into a leadership role like that, and
Yeah,
an important purpose as well.
yes, it was a shift. And at the same time, there was also an element of isolation as a therapist. And I really wanted to be more in community with other practitioners and also support trainees as well to have a different training experience to what I had and to what many of my colleagues have. So, yes, it does have its challenges and it is different. And at the same time, it's so rewarding as well.
It's wonderful.
Mm.
Yeah, that point you're making there about helping people to have a better experience in their training than you did, um, and supporting people in their training, racially minoritized people in particular. This is a big theme in psychotherapy, isn't it?
Mhm.
In terms of how minoritized people feel during their training, and there's that inbuilt complete irony of therapy training being experienced as um, oppressive, punishing, problematic, psychologically disturbing for people because of often, I think, because of just a utter lack of awareness of from the trainer's perspective and the training organization's perspective on the emissions and the deficits and the harms. I think often it, it's a total lack of awareness,
Mhm.
and it still does some significant harm. Can you share a little bit about some of those experiences from either your perspective or stories that you've heard?
Yeah, absolutely. So, from my perspective, there was definitely an element of almost kind of like tokenism within my training in the sense that there would be, for example, an LGBTQ plus session on one particular day, and it was focused in on that day and it wasn't really fed into the curriculum. So it felt very siloed, and then it felt clunky in terms of really seeing how to support queer and trans communities as part of day-to-day practice. And also this idea of diversity and inclusion, it was very old school, very kind of 90s, 2000s, this idea of implementing strategies or equality. And for me, it really is about justice work and moving beyond having enough Black people. It's really about what we do next and how we progress our conversations and our narratives. And often in training courses and mine as well, it was still this idea of, if we have enough Black people on our course, we're okay. And if we happen to be in a diverse area and have people coming towards us who are Black and brown, then the work is done. But actually, that doesn't really mean anything. It's really how we're teaching and how we're supporting our trainees to become practitioners who work anti-oppressively rather than just focusing on tokenistic diversity and inclusion strategies.
That's right. And I think we've come to a much deeper understanding. I say we, but who do I mean by we? And if I say we, I'll say maybe I'm speaking about people that run training organisations like I do. I think I've coming to a different level of understanding for my organisation. For example, being clear on what queer meant and queering meant just was straightforward obvious for me, because we're psychosexual and relationship therapists specialists. So gender, sexuality, relationship diversities were just obviously something that needed to be properly incorporated. And in our organisation has an EDI strategy and all of those things to improve so-called inclusion. Then you lean into it and you think, actually, this anti-oppression is very different to EDI. It's very different. It's looking at what's being taught in the curriculum and whether it's being challenged or not, and what isn't being taught. So, as we've shared together, we're working on a decolonizing process in my organization now. And when you properly understand what that means, all of the subjects look different. They look different. Teaching trauma looks different when you put a racially minoritized lens on the subject of trauma. Thinking about anger and rage, understanding people's responses in the context of being minoritized. It's a whole other lens. It's a whole other level of content. It's not just about a tag-on module or improving access. I think the improving access is an important piece of the work, but requires understanding the barriers properly. But what's really been profound for me is thinking, my goodness, look at what was missing when you just didn't have the right lens on, didn't have the right pair of glasses on. And I think that's there's organisations like your organisation and some of the fantastic literature that's been published over very recent years. It's completely shifted the picture from EDI to anti-oppression and what anti-oppression means. So yeah, really, I appreciate that change, and also what it must be like to be on a course that hasn't made those changes. And some of our students would have felt some of that because we didn't know what wasn't there.
And there's also the legacy of a colonial history and the impact that that's had on psychotherapy. So we have Freud's racism, Jung, this idea of the Black mind and psyche being inferior, and also other marginalized identities and sexism and patriarchy. So it's almost like we're still seeing these theories taught and normalized and prioritized without any acknowledgement of the harm and the roots of colonial violence, essentially, that they're encased in. And that in and of itself creates an experience of loneliness within courses.
Yeah.
And it's also traumatic to be studying a theory that dehumanizes you, and to have to do that for 4 years, and then to come out and be in a profession that is still really lonely and it's difficult to find people who work anti-oppressively and have a particular politic to them and to their mindset. So it's a tough journey. And at the same time, we're also being expected to be vulnerable, to share how we feel in process groups, in groups that are predominantly full of white people, and whiteness isn't acknowledged as an identity marker within process groups often. I mean, of course there might be exceptions, but that creates another layer of trauma. And that's happened within the context of my training, but also I hear stories every other day of people dropping out, feeling incredibly uncomfortable and traumatized for years, or feeling that they have to get through, but it's by the time they qualify, often there's a lot of pain.
It's really, really affecting, isn't it? To think of that, and to know that, not think of that, to know that. You know, I came along to the Justice for Therapy conference that your organisation ran in November, and I mean, it was a really important event for me, and I have so much to reflect on still from that experience. But I'd describe it as one of the most important events I've ever attended, and I mean that sincerely. And I've been reflecting on why, and it was because the place, the setting, the way it was held was so authentic, and authenticity and integrity are really deep values for me. And that space was held with relational warmth by yourself and your team, and the experience was real, and it was real and confronting and deeply upsetting. Some of the stories that we heard, because we were talking about the experience of racialized minorities in psychotherapy training, and those stories are awful, still happening in the here and now. This is not a historical thing, and yet it was still such a brilliant event to attend because of the heart that was in it. So I really appreciate that. I know you're running another one in March online, aren't you? March 25. Right. So we'll need to make sure people are aware of that and they can go along.
Thank you. It was a risk to run something that had different pricing for white people and global majority and racialized practitioners. And that was one of the ways that we really wanted to practice justice. It was a naming that we're not all starting from the same place. And that shows up in our economics as well, and the amount of money we charge, how much disposable income we have, how likely we are to be in more senior roles. And all of that is reflected within our system. And the conference was a place to really, for us as a team, to intentionally practice justice as much as we could, including the intimacy and the heart of justice work, which is something I really believe in, because without that, we can't create enough momentum and enough care, and we end up re-traumatizing and re-experiencing. And then there's this process of trying to do justice work and burning out, and then being really affected and not being able to collectively move towards this goal that we have, that many of us share.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very precious space. I felt very privileged to be able to take part. And that's a very loaded word, privilege, isn't it? It's a word that has multiple layers in it. And understanding one's relationship to privilege is a key part of anti-oppressive practice, isn't it? And I think the things you've mentioned so far are, you know, understanding whiteness and the impact of whiteness, like any other so-called majority. I say so-called because so who says that these things are majorities? But you know, in terms of non-minoritized identities, let's put it that way, we're not called to reflect on or examine anything that hasn't been othered. And if you're a white person, you haven't been othered in this culture, anything like in the same way. So you're not called to think about race in the same way as somebody who's racially minoritized is. But to speaking as a white person with those experiences, going through your layers of unawareness, that's not good English, but going through the layers of unconscious privilege it's work. It takes real time, because you know especially if you come from a position of being you know, liberal and loving and open-hearted, and not treating people differently on purpose, and not seeing any kind of sense of superiority in yourself, you're not really aware of how that's playing out and how you're benefiting from it until you get into the examination of it. And that's personal development work. I don't think we can directly teach that into people. You have to want to do that.
And similarly, there's also lighter skinned privilege, within the context of colorism and shadeism and what that affords. And that's something that I experience as a lighter skinned person that I'm very aware of. So it's not just about necessarily race in the most simplistic terms, but there are so many layers, so many axes of power and privilege that we all hold and need to be aware of. And there is real labor attached to it that requires energy and some kind of sustenance as well. And we were talking a little bit about how community is really important so that we can keep doing that work rather than being in a place where we feel really isolated, grappling with these identities and points of power and privilege, but also not necessarily having the context, the practice, the language to be able to do that work.
No, I agree. I've always said that one of the worst outcomes from any form of diversity training, one of the worst outcomes, which I see repeatedly happen, is where the fear is increased in the space because the themes are so confronting, that the fear is increased, and the people who are holding conscious or unconscious power and privilege psychologically exit. And they go, this is too hard, I can't get this right, I'm just going to keep getting it wrong, I'm frightened to offend, I'm just exiting. And we worked, it took us some time to get the tonality right on gender, sexuality and relationship diversity and kicks to prevent that reaction from cisgender heterosexual people, which I've got empathy for. I understand that, oh, this is too hard, this is too hard. But when we're talking about race, and which of course is a completely totally made up social construct, but so difficult to talk about when we talk about race and racially minoritized identities, the temperature goes right up. Everyone's anxious because everyone goes into a trauma response. If we saw the whole process through a trauma lens, and remembering that we're psychotherapists, we're supposed to know this stuff, right? If we saw it all through a trauma lens, it would all make complete sense. What we see, it just makes total sense. Everyone's gone into fight or flight or another of the responses, and that makes sense of all of these behaviors. But when you come into it, unaware or unexamined and unreflective, just it's all about threat and fear and withdrawal, and nothing changes when we're in that state.
And there's no learning as well.
Nothing's onboarded, is it?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's tender work, and it does take time. And I think for white people, I think it takes a real desire to make a difference and to understand, to peel through the layers, because just being well-intentioned, which I was guilty of, and just really well-intentioned and want to love everyone and bring everyone in, it's not good enough. It's not enough to learn about this stuff, to get the context. So I think the kind of awarenesses that you're helping to raise are just so vital. I'm really grateful for that. Is there anything else you wanted to share in terms of the kinds of experiences that racially minoritized people are having on trainings that you could share so that we can extend the learning and help accelerate the change for people who are training providers like myself?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the components that tends to happen is a lack of modeling from a tutor perspective. And it's really difficult for trainees to then feel that there's a culture of safety within their nervous system, within their body and their mind, so that they know that if something is concerning or difficult, that it's okay to name, that there's a process where they can seek support, and where their minoritized identities are centered in that process. So there's been generally, for many folks, a process of maybe naming that they were uncomfortable around whiteness and that being shut down. Or the modality is weaponized and somebody is told, well, these are your defenses, rather than actually saying this is racism, this is sexism, homophobia, or naming whatever other oppression is in the room. And to me, that is such a kind of violent and colonial perspective on conflict management, that retreating into the theory rather than being able to be human and have a human to human interaction where a trainee can say, I'm feeling really wounded right now, or I'm feeling afraid. And that can be centered without the cloak of the modality being used as a way of essentially obfuscating the issue. And so this is quite subtle, and it doesn't always come up in a way that's easy to identify. But this is one of the kind of like things that are felt and difficult to name, and when they build up, they add to huge mental and emotional distress, gaslighting as well, and then presenteeism, as we're saying, not engaging in learning because there's too much trauma in the body, and that then affects clinical work and the development of practitioners. So that, I mean, that's just one component. And there are many more as well.
No, it's so important. And where it goes to, in my mind, again, is to be able to model. You need to know what's happening. To know what's happening, you need to understand context and bring in if you're sitting in a position as a course leader or a teacher of, I'm teaching this modality and teaching the theory without understanding how it's where its own heritage and the theory's heritage, and how it lands on people, and who it emits, who it excludes. So it's a very individualistic set of theories. The white Western psychotherapy is very individualistic. We're focused on this individual, and if we're lucky and have been trained in an organization that's got that broader perspective, we think systemically. So well done, we think about the family. But what about this whacking great big impact of culture and society? So that biopsychosocial combination, the longer I've been a teacher at KICS, the more I think culture, the social piece, influences everything. But if you don't know what's in that, if you don't know the nuances of an individual's cultural heritage, and you don't know history because it's not taught, because guess what? Dominant history, people who are dominant in society control the history, then you've just got no context. So you could be speaking and working in a way that just is devoid of context for that individual. So it lands in really oppressive and frankly ignorant spaces, doesn't it? And I've likely been guilty of that myself. I've looked at innocently at someone, I thought, why is this reaction happening? And then you go, oh, it's happening because look what's behind this person, what's behind this person's heritage, what's behind my heritage, who am I symbolizing in this moment, and how is that affecting this person in this space?
And there's still an assumption that therapy is supposed to fix us so that we can go back into an oppressive system, right, so that we can be productive, go back to work, go back to consuming in so many different ways. And that really decenters liberation from the conversation. And that's also something that tends to be completely eclipsed in most training courses. This idea of what do we even mean by liberation? How do we get free? And what does that mean for us as individuals, but also for our collective, and not just our collective of therapists, but also our wider community as well. And being invested in this idea of becoming more and more liberated in whatever way, and being in that process of really gathering our agency and our power and being able to support other people to do that as well. So that really mines the foundation of therapy. You know, why are we offering therapy to our clients? Is it so that they can tolerate more pain, or is it so that they can get free? And if we're teaching it from the perspective of, well, we're just going to fix people so that they can be another cog in a machine, that creates a lot of hopelessness for many people who are politicized, Black people, people of color, Indigenous folks, folks with disabilities, and other marginalizations. So it's a big, to be honest, it's a big, big question. How
Yeah,
do we orientate towards liberation? It's something that, as an organization, we sit with a lot.
yeah, that's you're right. It's a systemic piece, and how much of our work is sustaining that system. And I guess what I keep returning to in my mind is the lack of awareness of the system. If the system isn't causing you harm that you're aware of, which would be for people who are not minoritized. There's no, it's a norm. Then it's not something that's understood. The system isn't understood to be supporting you, because you're unconscious of it supporting you until you become conscious, and you're like, oh, okay, this is not a fair playing field. This is not equal. Yeah, it's very difficult. In our specialism of sex and relationship therapy, just the whole way science has treated people of color, the whole diagnostic criteria. We give the diagnostic criteria a good kick about in kicks because it's very heteronormative. The diagnostic criteria for psychosexual problems are hugely heteronormative. But then you look at the history of diagnostic criteria in the context of race, and it's appalling. It's utterly appalling. And that's the heritage this profession has. And then people of colour choosing to come into the profession when they have this kind of heritage, and then looking at the reality of the here and now. It's just a miracle anybody wants to get involved, to be honest. In terms of how, just how unconsciously, I keep saying unconsciously, but at some point there must be something conscious, oppressive the whole thing is. It does take it's going to take time to work through, and it's a process that does take time. The invitation that I picked up for myself was to take that time and to get involved on a personal development level. And that's a big commitment for people to make when they're trying to run schools and they're trying to do the best and all of these things. And I don't think it's an option, but I don't think there's a fast track. Am I making sense? I don't think there's something you can fast track yourself and go, you're not going to go on a CPD, and then I'll have a checklist that'll teach me how to not be oppressive in my training school. It's a bit more complicated than that.
And it goes back to that piece around vulnerability, intimacy. It's so deeply personal. And for people at director level, tutors, course leaders, sometimes there's a separation in terms of I'm this person at work, I'm competent at work. And what is it like to step into a place where you might be fearful, where you need to reimagine or unlearn or feel really vulnerable and worry about perhaps saying the wrong thing, or being worried that you might not be held. And these are really common experiences that people go through when they're engaging with anti-oppressive work, with justice work, that they're kind of a good sign. It means that we're in the ring, that we're, we're going to make a mistake. That's okay. Or multiple mistakes, a lifetime of mistakes, and that's okay. But if we're too afraid to even start, then it's such a shame. And it's a shame for everyone, and it's a shame for ourselves as well. And there are so many wounds within white supremacy that are really about white folks losing access to their heart, you call it whatever you like, soulfulness, their own sense of depth, because white supremacy dehumanizes white people too. It's not just about Black people and people of color. It really is to be the perpetrator, to be an agent within white supremacy. It requires us to be disconnected from our feeling states and to be numb. And that in and of itself is oppressive. And that can be applied to any other system of oppression and dominant group. So it's a journey that's hard, but it's worthwhile. I'm biased. That's what I think anyway.
I'm also biased. I think it's worthwhile, and I think that's a really important point. We get detached from our own histories and our own history of violence, either as perpetrators of violence, and saying we in this context are white people, and also I've been on the receiving end. You know, my heritage is working class, and you know, when I think about my lineage would have been in, you know, people who are more likely to be indentured than to be in charge, right? So there's such a lot potentially in common then with people who have been racialized. We've all been racialized. People who've been minoritized and abused, and the complexity of how indentured people were turned against slaves, and the myth of being better and more important was created. You think, gosh, that's in our epigenetics as well as in you know, our colleagues who've got heritages of been on the receiving end of those horrors. Yeah, it runs very deep, and you're quite right. We get because I was going to say on the sanitized version. If I think about the history that I was taught, and the history I've witnessed my children being taught, not a mention of slavery, I can tell you. Not a mention. Some of the horrors of the medieval era might have been mentioned, but usually the focus is around the royal family lines and learning all about the kings and the occasional queen, and the world wars. Gosh, because we like to cast ourselves into the in the winner light, don't we? Yeah, such a lot to unpack. If there was a this is an impossible question because it's not something we can distill down in this way, but if there was a kind of an invitation or a request you could issue out to anybody that's in a position of being able to influence psychotherapy trainings in the UK, if there was, you know, some form of request or direction that you would give, you know, the message to the course directors or the message to the course creators, what kind of things would come to mind for you to ask, to invite?
So starting with the leadership of the most marginalized, and that is all about bringing in and also supporting the leadership within the training organization, and supporting people to come through and share their voices, but also in a way where they're being paid, they're being honored for their time, their labor, their skills. And understanding that we need to, in order to decolonize the curriculum, we need different voices. We need to decenter whiteness. And to decenter whiteness, we can't just have white people in positions of power deciding what's included in the curriculum and what isn't. So that would be a starting point, as well as simply, well, maybe it isn't that simple, but starting with the acknowledging of the roots of oppression within the theories that are being taught, if those theories really do have to be taught, and that's a whole conversation in and of itself. There's a piece around naming, where does this come from? What was the social context at the time? How has that impacted marginalized people for decades? How is it impacting Black and Brown and Indigenous therapists within the cohort who have to endure this? That acknowledgement would make such a difference. It would increase the levels of safety, as well as perhaps training being something that we can engage with in a critical way. And that's something that when we work together as a team, we all have different training modalities that we bring in, and we love to kind of sit and compare and imagine from different perspectives and say, you know, this particular piece from my training is really useful, but that criticality around this isn't, I'm actually going to leave this behind, or this is oppressive. And wouldn't it be great if that could be part of an education institution so that trainees learn how to do that, rather than it just being our kind of niche within our service doing that? So there are lots of things, but those are a couple that come to mind.
Yeah, really powerful, really powerful. I've been lucky to have a couple of colleagues within CICS who have gently and persistently tried to bring things to my awareness. And I'm smiling because I have a level of embarrassment of how long it took me to properly hear, because I think of myself as very much in the committed to anti-oppressive practice, and really did have quite a bias towards focusing on queer identities, and hadn't really queer identities and disability, had not seen what was missing from a race perspective, really hadn't. So had a whole level of awareness and still a whole load of layers left. But I've had a couple of colleagues that are in the organisation who have chipped away at helping me become more aware. And one of the things I wanted to kind of share from that experience is that how difficult it can be for a person with a minoritised identity to help somebody who's in charge and is white to hear something. And if in my context, my organisation has a reputation for being open to feedback and responding to it. I personally go through a little bit of an arc of, try to keep it private, arc of defensiveness, because we worked so hard to make this a good organisation, but someone will tell me, say something's not good enough, I'll go, isn't it? And then go through a little arc and then go, you're quite right, and I'll go and fix that. But so we've got a good reputation for listening and responding. I have, and the organisation has. And even with that reputation, even with people who've been seeing that for a number of years, it's still it's still challenging to directly tell somebody when they don't think they're getting it right. And that comes from the risk of speaking up. So I think that I've been in conversations with my colleagues where I said, just tell me directly, give me a kick up the bum and tell me. And they're going, it's not that easy, Julie. And I said, I'm really approachable. Yes, you're really approachable, and it's not that easy to tell you what you can't see. I can't see it for you. And I also can't, it's difficult just to even voice something directly. My experience of working with my Black colleagues is I need to shut up for a beat or two longer than I think I need to give someone the space to feel safe enough to say, I'm assuming safety. I'm here, I'm listening. But it's not good enough. You need to shush for a bit and let a person feel safe enough and properly tune in. So I think people might feel like, marginalised people might feel like they're speaking up and not being heard. And it might be that the volume button's not quite right, or the attunement's not quite there. That's the white person's responsibility. I'm not putting that responsibility on marginalised people, but it's been in my experience. I wanted to kind of share that. That I'm literally sitting there with all my bouncy energy going, tell me, and they're like, well, if you shut up for 5 minutes, I might be able to get to the stage where I can put this into words, Julie.
And it's also labor.
Yes,
There's so much labor, because it's the accumulation of all of the labor that collectively we've done and are doing as part of our day-to-day lives. And yes, absolutely, there are lots of opportunities to share feedback, to be able to provide steers around how things could be different. And at the same time, at least as a Black person, I've often reverted to this feeling of I just need to get through the day. I need to think about what's important for my family. I need to manage my own nervous system that is being assaulted by multiple genocides, wars, and climate change, and general devastation in the world. And if there's feedback that I need to give, I might not always be available for that. And perhaps there's also that piece around creating listening opportunities and time for trust and all of that, but also knowing that sometimes things don't emerge, and that for directors and course leaders, they might not fully be hearing what's going on within their organization. They might not be receiving that feedback. And a lot of the reasons that people share with us is because we're not a training provider. We provide placements, but we don't offer training ourselves. And so it's an external space where they can be vulnerable and say, I'm really struggling with this, or I'm really struggling with that. And sometimes we can take all of that and support training providers to do things differently, and sometimes we can't, and it's just something that we need to hold. But ultimately, it's so different when you're in a space with racially minoritized colleagues and what you can share versus being in a space with a white person. We sometimes don't have capacity.
I really appreciate you speaking into that. Yeah, and I think that sometimes I thought what's coming into my awareness is I think I need to kind of absent myself from the space so that people can find their words and then find their way to share those with me, rather than it all being expected in the same space at the same time, because it does take courage, you know. And I can find contexts in which it would have been really difficult for me to speak. So in my past corporate life, like before I was in this world, I was almost always the only woman on a board. And so you get a flavor of how you mask your thoughts, how you mask your behaviors, how you behave differently when you're the only something identity in a space, and what that does in terms of your ability to be honest and feel safe, which is so this it's not at all the same, but there's a flavor that's similar in terms of experiences that you can read across. And just if a person requires a bit of empathy to connect to the experience, then I think there is a real requirement for empathy for a Black experience from a white person's perspective. There can be a lack of empathy. There can be a competition of lack of privilege, especially in contexts of people who are white with multiple other minoritized identities. It can be a little bit of a yes butting. Yes, but I'm working class. Yes, but I'm a woman. Yes, but I'm queer. Yes, but I mean, shut all of that up and just listen to one another. Yeah,
and that practice of decentering whiteness, as you're saying, is sometimes knowing when to remove yourself from the space, when that's a service, or when you need to share the mic, or when you need to devolve power, or when you need to perhaps not be the first person to share your opinion, and very intentionally wait for your colleagues to share what they think. And that intersects into so many other dimensions of power. But the piece around decentering whiteness, what does it look like when courses are run in a way where whiteness is decentered in a way that's intentional, consistent, and there's a commitment from the entire teaching team to do that? It really takes on a completely different form to what we see most of the time.
No, you're right. A lot of work to do there. But I'm with you. I think it's worthwhile. There's something fundamentally right about it, and that comes back to our values on fairness, justice, integrity, sincerity. I think that's what our profession is supposed to stand for. It doesn't always, but that's what I'd like it to stand for. And we can strive for that as training providers, as well as in our clinical practice. Is there anything you haven't had an opportunity to say in our conversation that you would like to say before we bring our conversation to a close?
Thank you. Well, you're putting me on the spot. I guess perhaps I wanted to end on courage and bringing that back into the room and into the conversation and inviting those who are listening to sense what courage looks like for you, what steps you might want to take with yourself, first of all, but also within your professional role, and what that then means in terms of the support that you need, how you can support your nervous system when you're taking these big, courageous steps, where you can go when you're feeling really shaken by the stress of it all or the trauma of it all, or when perhaps we do too much and we have to retreat. What does that look like? How can we stay in that dance of courage, essentially, but also knowing when to rest and knowing when to pause and to listen to ourselves and to care for ourselves? That is justice work. For me, anyway, that's what justice work looks like as well. It's not just about organizing or change work. It's fundamentally how can we tend to ourselves in a loving way and tend to each other as well.
Thank you. I think that's a really powerful final message. I want to just check in with you before we end. If there's anything that has been said that has been difficult for you, anything I might have misspoken or said that's left any kind of impact on you, given that we both have very different racialized identities and coming at this from a really different lived experience and levels. For me, this is all about intentional learning, and for people who are racially minoritized, this is life. I get to choose to learn about it. I mean, that's some privilege, right? You get to live this day in, day out without an option. So I just wanted to kind of check in with you on what it's been, if I've left you with anything, if there's anything that needs to be repaired or reflected on, given that you've had the courage to come and share this space with me.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I feel actually quite alive having had this conversation and having also had the space to name lots of dynamics of whiteness and white supremacy, and being able to talk to a white ally about things in a way that has been really, really refreshing and really clear, and I feel really settled in myself. So thank you for all the care that you've put into this process.
Oh no, you're very welcome, and I'm very conscious of not wanting to invite thanks or praise, because it genuinely, it's always lovely to hear something being validated that you're trying so hard to get right. But my intentionality is to ensure that both yours and my nervous system feels regulated in this space, and we leave the space feeling connected and mutually respected and not activated or left with anything. And if something does come up, an echo, I call them, when you have a little echo, you think, what was that word? What was that thought? Please come back to me, give me the opportunity to repair it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your time, and we'll make sure that our students, and we're not exactly the broadest reach in social media, but we'll make sure that people know about the Justice for Therapy process, because I would really encourage white people to pick up a white solidarity ticket and just go along and listen. And it's really, there's something really gorgeous about shutting up and listening. And just, I find it really relaxing to just go and listen and open yourself up, and without defense. And there's an awful lot to learn in those spaces, and we don't get invited into them very often.
Thank you. We look forward to welcoming your community.
Thank you, Kim.